The dust kicked up by Thomas Mackenzie's boots hadn't yet settled when he spotted the finest stallion he'd ever laid eyes on. Black as midnight with a white star blazing across its forehead, the horse stood proud in the makeshift corral behind Jeremiah Colt's trading post. Thomas had ridden 3 days from his spread near Tombstone, his own mount growing lame, desperately needing a replacement before the cattle drive to Denver. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the barren landscape, and sweat stained his shirt as he approached the weathered fence posts. But as he got closer, something else caught his attention that made his blood run cold and his heart pound with righteous anger. A young woman sat in the meager shade of a gnarled mesquite tree, her slender wrists bound with coarse rope that had rubbed the skin raw and bloody. Her ankles were tied to iron stakes driven deep into the hard, packed earth, preventing any hope of escape. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with auburn hair that caught the late afternoon sun like burnished copper and skin bronzed by years of outdoor work. Her dress, once probably a cheerful blue calico, was now faded to gray and torn in several places, stained with dust, sweat, and what looked like dried tears. When she looked up at Thomas with haunted green eyes, he saw a mixture of fear, desperation, and a flickering ember of hope that hadn't quite been extinguished despite whatever horrors she'd endured. Thomas had seen many terrible things in his 42 years on the frontier. He'd fought Apaches in hand-to-hand combat, survived 3 years of drought that killed half his cattle, weathered flash floods that washed away entire homesteads, and buried a beloved wife and 2 precious children to scarlet fever that swept through the territory like God's own judgment. But he'd never seen a human being treated like livestock, chained up and displayed for sale like a piece of property, and the sight made his jaw clench with barely contained rage. He'd heard whispered rumors of such things happening in the most lawless corners of the territory, where desperate men would sell anything of value to survive another day, but seeing it with his own eyes was entirely different. This wasn't just morally wrong. It was an abomination that went against everything he believed about human dignity and the fundamental rights that every person possessed simply by virtue of being born. Jeremiah Colt emerged from his ramshackle building like a spider sensing movement in his web. He was a weasel of a man with tobacco-stained teeth, thinning hair greased back with bare fat, and pale blue eyes that never quite met yours straight on when he spoke. He wore a Confederate officer's jacket that had seen better days, threadbare and missing most of its brass buttons, a pathetic reminder of battles lost and Southern pride wounded beyond repair. The war had ended 15 years ago, but some men carried it with them like a festering wound that refused to heal, poisoning everything they touched with their bitterness and defeat. "Thomas Mackenzie, as I live and breathe," Colt called out, his voice oily with false cheer and calculated friendliness. "Heard through the grapevine you might be coming this way. That black stallion caught your eye, did it? That's a fine piece of horseflesh right there, friend. Cost you $200 cash money, but he's worth every penny and more. Strong as an ox, fast as the desert wind, and already trained to work cattle. Won't find better breeding stock this side of San Antonio." Thomas forced himself to look away from the bound girl and focus on the horse, though every instinct screamed at him to confront Colt immediately about the human being he was keeping in chains. The stallion was indeed magnificent, with clean muscular lines, intelligent dark eyes, and the kind of proud bearing that spoke of good bloodlines and careful training. His ranch desperately needed quality breeding stock to improve his herd, and this animal would serve that purpose admirably. But every fiber of his being revolted against the idea of conducting any kind of business with a man who would treat another human being like merchandise to be bought and sold. "The horse looks fine enough," Thomas said, keeping his voice carefully neutral despite the storm of emotion raging inside him. "But I'm more curious about the girl over there. What exactly is her story, Colt?" Colt's practiced smile faltered slightly, and he glanced nervously toward the bound woman as if he'd hoped Thomas wouldn't notice her presence. "Oh, her. That's just Sarah. Took her in trade from a family heading back east after their luck ran out. Times are mighty hard out here, you know how it is. Sometimes a man's got to make difficult choices just to survive another season. She's strong as a mule, can cook and clean with the best of them. Knows her way around horses and cattle better than most men. I'm asking $300 for her contract, but for you, being an old friend and all, I might consider dropping that to $250. The casual matter-of-fact way Colt spoke about selling a human being made Thomas's stomach turn with revulsion. He'd fought in the war himself, proudly wearing Union blue, believing with every fiber of his being that all men and women deserved freedom, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. The idea that such practices were still occurring in 1880, 15 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the bloody conflict that had torn the nation apart, was almost incomprehensible to him. He looked back at Sarah, and she met his gaze with quiet dignity that somehow survived despite her degrading circumstances. There was unmistakable intelligence in those green eyes, and an inner strength that hadn't been broken despite whatever horrors and humiliations she'd been forced to endure. "I came here to buy a horse, Colt, not a person," Thomas said carefully, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt peacemaker on his hip. "Slavery's been illegal for 15 years now. What you're doing here is against federal law and everything this country stands for." Colt's laugh was harsh and bitter, like the cackle of a buzzard over fresh carrion. "Law? You talking about law way out here? The nearest federal marshal is 200 miles away in Tucson, and he's got bigger problems than worrying about one little girl. Besides, this ain't slavery, friend. This is indentured servitude, perfectly legal according to territorial statute. Her family owed me money they couldn't pay, and she's working it off fair and square. Problem is, at the rate she's going, factoring in her room and board, she'll be working for me for the next 20 years or more." Thomas knew it was a lie wrapped in legal-sounding language. True indentured servitude might be technically legal in some circumstances, but what he was witnessing here was human trafficking, pure and simple. The heavy ropes, the iron stakes, the fear and desperation in the girl's eyes, the way Colt spoke about her like she was livestock, this was slavery in everything but name, a system designed to trap vulnerable people in permanent bondage. His hand tightened on his gun grip, but he forced himself to remain calm. Violence would only make the situation worse, especially for Sarah, and might result in her being hurt or killed in the crossfire. "What if I wanted to buy out her contract?" Thomas asked, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "What would that cost me?" Colt's pale eyes lit up with unmistakable greed, like a gambler seeing 4 aces in his hand. "Well now, that's mighty interesting, Thomas. Like I said, $300 would transfer all her papers to you free and clear. Of course, you'd be taking on responsibility for her keep and care, and she's got about 18 years left on her original contract. Might be more profitable in the long run to just take the horse and leave well enough alone, if you catch my meaning." Thomas looked at Sarah again, and this time she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow clear as a church bell in the desert silence. Despite her bonds and her obvious fear, there was dignity in the way she held herself, and courage in her willingness to speak at all. "Take me instead," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Please, mister. I'll work for you, cook your meals, tend your livestock, whatever you need me to do. I won't cause any trouble or try to run away. I just can't stay here another day. I'd rather die than spend another night in this place." The desperation and quiet courage in her voice nearly broke Thomas's heart into pieces. He could see the purple bruises on her arms where rough hands had grabbed her, the hollow look in her cheeks that spoke of insufficient food, the haunted expression of someone who'd given up all hope until this very moment. He thought of his own daughter Mary, who would have been about Sarah's age if the fever hadn't taken her 5 years ago, and knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't turn his back and ride away from this situation. "I'll give you $500, Thomas said to Colt, his voice steady despite the emotional hurricane raging inside his chest. $200 for the horse as agreed, and $300 for the girl's complete freedom. But I want all her contract papers, and I want them marked as paid in full and legally void. No loopholes, no tricks, no future claims on her service." Colt's eyes widened with surprise and naked delight. $500 was more hard currency than he'd seen in 6 months, enough to keep him supplied with whiskey and provisions through the harsh winter months ahead. Without another word, he practically ran back into his dilapidated building to fetch the necessary papers, leaving Thomas alone with Sarah for the first time since his arrival. "You don't have to do this for me," Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know you came here for a horse, not to rescue some stranger you've never met before. I don't want to be a burden on you or your family. You don't owe me anything." Thomas knelt down beside her in the dust, and began working at the thick ropes binding her wrists, his movements gentle but efficient. His hands were calloused and scarred from decades of ranch work, but his touch was surprisingly tender as he worked to free her without causing additional pain to her already damaged skin. "What's your real story, Sarah?" he asked softly. "And please don't give me that indentured servant nonsense. I can see with my own eyes what's really happening here." Sarah's green eyes filled with tears that she stubbornly refused to let fall, maintaining her dignity even in this moment of vulnerability. "My family had a small farm about 50 miles north of here, near the Dragoon Mountains. Drought took our crops 2 years running, and we couldn't pay our debts to the bank or the supply store. Colt showed up one day with official-looking papers claiming my father owed him money we'd never borrowed. But the documents seemed legal enough, and when we couldn't pay what he claimed we owed, he said he'd take me instead of foreclosing on the farm. Said I could work off the debt in a year, maybe 2 at the most, but it's been much longer than that," Thomas observed, finally getting the ropes loose from her wrists. The skin underneath was raw and badly scarred from months of constant chafing against the coarse hemp. 3 years this coming October," Sarah whispered, rubbing her freed wrists gingerly. 3 long years, and somehow the debt keeps growing larger instead of smaller. He charges me for food, for the rags I wear, for the corner of the barn where I sleep, for everything. Says at this rate I'll never work it off, that I might as well accept my situation and stop causing trouble. And the things he's wanted me to do, the demands he's made." She shuddered visibly and couldn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood her meaning perfectly. Thomas's jaw tightened with murderous rage as he worked on the ropes around her ankles. He'd suspected as much from the moment he'd seen her chained up like an animal, and having his suspicions confirmed made him want to put a bullet through Jeremiah Colt's black heart. But that would make him a murderer in the eyes of the law, and more importantly, it wouldn't help Sarah or the other victims who might come after her. Sometimes the hardest thing a man could do was walk away from a fight, even when every instinct screamed for violent retribution. Colt returned with the papers, grinning like a cat who'd found a bowl of fresh cream. The documents were crudely written on cheap paper, but they appeared legal enough for frontier standards where formal education was scarce and legal expertise even scarcer. Thomas read them carefully, noting the outrageous terms and the way the supposed debt seemed to compound monthly at impossible rates. It was obviously a carefully constructed trap designed to keep Sarah and others like her in permanent bondage, legal slavery disguised as legitimate business. "Just sign right here at the bottom," Colt said, producing a bottle of India ink and a worn quill pen. "And I'll need the full $500 up front, of course. Cash money, no credit or promises." Thomas counted out the bills from his worn leather wallet, money he'd saved carefully over 6 months of careful living and hard work. It represented his plans to expand his herd, improve his ranch buildings, and maybe even hire additional help for the upcoming cattle drive. But as he looked at Sarah, now free from her bonds and standing shakily beside him on unsteady legs, he knew beyond any doubt that it was the best investment he'd ever made in his entire life. The transaction completed with Colt's greedy signature on the transfer papers, Thomas helped Sarah climb onto the black stallion behind him. She was weak from months of poor nutrition and brutal treatment, and he could feel her trembling like a frightened bird as she held onto his waist for support. They rode away from Colt's trading post in heavy silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what had just happened and what it might mean for their uncertain future. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the vast desert sky in brilliant shades of orange, purple, and gold. They made their first camp beside a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, where Thomas built a modest fire and shared his trail provisions with Sarah. She ate slowly and carefully, as if afraid the food might be snatched away from her at any moment, and Thomas noticed how she kept glancing around nervously, as if expecting Colt to appear from the gathering darkness and drag her back into captivity. "You're safe now, Sarah," Thomas said gently, handing her his own bedroll and keeping only a thin blanket for himself. "I know it's hard to believe after everything you've been through, but I give you my word that no one is ever going to hurt you like that again." Sarah looked at him across the flickering orange firelight, her green eyes searching his weathered face for any sign of deception or hidden motive. "Why did you do it? You don't know anything about me except my name. I could be a thief, a murderer, a woman of ill repute, anything at all. You just spent a fortune on a complete stranger based on nothing but sympathy. Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, sending bright sparks spiraling up into the star-filled desert sky. My late wife Elizabeth used to say that we're all responsible for each other in this life. That turning away from suffering when we have the power to help makes us less human than the animals. I lost her and my 2 children to scarlet fever 5 years ago, and for a long while afterward, I thought about giving up entirely. Selling the ranch, maybe heading to California or Oregon to start fresh somewhere else. But then I realized that running away from pain doesn't make it disappear. It just makes you empty inside, like a shell with nothing left to protect. I'm truly sorry for your terrible loss, Sarah said softly, genuine compassion evident in her voice despite her own recent suffering. That must have been unbearable for you. It was the darkest time of my life, Thomas admitted. But it taught me something important about what really matters. Life's too short and too hard to waste on hatred or revenge, and too precious to ignore the suffering of others when you have the power to make a difference. When I saw you chained up like an animal back there, I knew I couldn't ride away and live with myself afterward. My conscience and my Christian faith wouldn't allow it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the peaceful night sounds of the desert. Coyotes howled mournfully in the distance, and somewhere nearby an owl called to its mate with haunting precision. The campfire crackled and popped, creating a small circle of warmth and light in the vast darkness that stretched endlessly in all directions. "What happens to me now?" Sarah asked eventually, her voice small and uncertain. "I know you paid for my contract and my freedom, but I don't want to be anyone's property ever again, not even yours. I'd rather die free out here in the desert than go back to being someone's slave." Thomas looked at her with deep respect and admiration. Despite everything she'd endured, her spirit remained unbroken. There was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes when she spoke of freedom and dignity. "The papers I signed tonight are going into this fire come morning," he said firmly. "You're not my property, Sarah, and you never will be. You're a free woman with the right to make your own choices about your life and your future." Sarah stared at him in complete shock, as if he'd just announced his intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. "You're just going to let me go, after spending all that money to free me? I didn't buy you." "Sarah," Thomas said with quiet intensity, "I bought your freedom from a man who had no right to own it in the first place. There's a world of difference between those two things. If you want to head back east where there are more opportunities for women, I'll give you enough money to make a proper start. If you want to try your luck in California or Oregon, I'll help you get there safely. The choice is entirely yours to make." For the first time since Thomas had found her, tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks, not tears of despair or hopelessness, but tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted through her tears. "My family scattered to the 4 winds after we lost the farm. I don't have any skills except farming and ranch work, and I wouldn't know how to survive in a big city back east." "Then come work for me," Thomas offered without hesitation. "Real work for real wages, the same as any hired hand. I desperately need help running the ranch, and you clearly need a place to start rebuilding your life. We can help each other while you figure out what you want to do with your future." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing dust and tears across her cheeks. "You'd really trust me with your ranch and your livestock? After everything that's happened, Sarah, in the past few hours, you've shown more courage, dignity, and basic human decency than most people display in an entire lifetime. You could have tried to manipulate me with false promises or desperate lies, but instead you spoke honestly about your situation and asked for nothing but a chance at freedom. That tells me everything I need to know about your true character." The next morning, Thomas made good on his solemn promise. He built up the campfire and ceremoniously fed Sarah's contract papers into the hungry flames, watching them curl and blacken until nothing remained but gray ash that scattered on the desert wind. Sarah watched the papers burn with tears of joy streaming down her face and something like wonder lighting up her green eyes. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd completely given up hope that I'd ever be free again." "Hope's a remarkably hard thing to kill completely," Thomas observed. "Sometimes it goes underground and hibernates for a while, but it has a way of growing back stronger when you least expect it, like desert flowers after a rare rain. The journey to Thomas's ranch took 2 full days of steady riding through increasingly beautiful country. During that time, Sarah began to come alive again like a plant receiving water after a long drought. Color returned to her pale cheeks, her shoulders straightened with returning confidence, and she started asking intelligent questions about the land, the cattle business, and the practical aspects of ranch management. Thomas was genuinely impressed by her knowledge and her quick, inquiring mind. It was clear that her farm background had given her valuable practical skills that would serve her well in her new life. The Mackenzie Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, with a comfortable adobe house, sturdy wooden barns, and corrals that housed some of the finest horses in the territory. A dozen experienced cowboys worked the vast herds of cattle that provided Thomas's livelihood and growing reputation. When Thomas rode in with Sarah beside him, the men gathered around curiously, wondering who this mysterious woman might be and what her presence might mean for their established routines. "Boys," Thomas announced, dismounting and helping Sarah down from the stallion with careful courtesy. "I'd like you all to meet Miss Sarah. She's going to be working here as my ranch manager and partner. I want you to treat her with the same respect and cooperation you'd show me, because her word will carry the same weight as mine." There were some surprised looks and a few quietly muttered comments among the cowboys, but Thomas's men were fundamentally loyal and disciplined. They'd learned to trust their boss's judgment over the years, and if he said this woman was to be respected and obeyed, then that's exactly how it would be. Over the following weeks and months, Sarah proved herself more than capable of handling the demanding responsibilities he'd given her. She had a natural eye for evaluating cattle, an almost mystical way with horses, and an organizational mind that impressed even the most skeptical of the veteran cowboys. But it wasn't just her professional competence that made such a powerful impression on everyone at the ranch. Sarah possessed a warmth and natural kindness that had somehow survived her terrible ordeal completely intact. She doctored sick and injured animals with gentle, healing hands, cooked hearty meals for cowboys recovering from injuries, and listened with genuine interest and compassion to the personal stories and problems of the men who worked the ranch. Slowly but surely, she became not just another employee but a vital, beloved part of the ranch family that Thomas had created over the years. Thomas found himself watching Sarah more and more as the seasons changed, admiring not just her obvious competence and intelligence, but her remarkable resilience and strength of character. She'd been through absolute hell, and somehow emerged with her fundamental humanity not only intact, but actually strengthened by the ordeal. She worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk without a single complaint, saved every penny of her wages with careful frugality, and never asked for special treatment or consideration because of her gender or her traumatic past. But more than all of that, she brought something precious back to the ranch that had been missing since his beloved wife's death: the sound of genuine laughter echoing through the house, the warmth of sincere caring and concern, and the sense that this place was more than just a business operation, but a true home where people genuinely cared about each other. One evening in late autumn, as they sat together on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, Sarah finally felt comfortable enough to speak about her past in complete detail. She told Thomas about her family's small but prosperous farm, about the 2 consecutive drought years that had destroyed their crops and their hopes, about the crushing weight of debt that had accumulated beyond their ability to pay, and about the terrible day when Jeremiah Colt had arrived with his fraudulent papers and evil intentions. The worst part of the whole nightmare wasn't the physical hardship or even the constant fear. She said quietly, her voice steady but filled with remembered pain. It was the way he tried to make me feel like I wasn't really human anymore, like I was just a piece of property to be used and discarded at will. He wanted me to believe deep down in my soul that I deserved everything that was happening to me, that I was fundamentally worthless and would never be anything more. Thomas reached over and gently took her hardened hand in his own, feeling the calluses that months of honest labor had created. "Sarah, you're honestly the strongest, most courageous person I've ever had the privilege to know. What you survived and overcame would have completely broken most people, but you somehow managed to keep your dignity, your kindness, your fundamental decency, and your hope for something better. That kind of inner strength and moral courage is rarer than gold and more precious than diamonds." Sarah looked at him with genuine surprise, as if the idea that she might be strong or admirable had never occurred to her before. I don't feel particularly strong most of the time. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding myself together and just trying to make it through to tomorrow. But that's exactly what real strength looks like. Thomas explained patiently. It's not about never being afraid or never feeling broken inside. True strength is about getting up every single morning and doing what needs to be done despite the fear, despite the pain, despite the doubt. It's about choosing to be kind and decent when the world has been cruel and indecent to you. That's the rarest and most admirable kind of courage there is. As the harsh winter months deepened and the ranch work shifted to indoor tasks and equipment maintenance, Sarah and Thomas grew steadily closer in ways that surprised them both. It wasn't a romance born of desperate passion or overwhelming physical attraction, but something much deeper and more lasting, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, compatible temperaments, and growing affection that deepened with each passing day. They worked together seamlessly during the daylight hours, managing the complex business of running a successful ranch and caring for hundreds of head of valuable cattle. In the peaceful evenings, they sat by the crackling fireplace, reading books together, making plans for future improvements and expansions, and talking honestly about their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for whatever the future might hold. Sarah had never had the opportunity to learn to read properly during her hard-scrabble childhood on the farm, so Thomas took on the role of patient teacher, working with her through basic letters and simple words until she could confidently handle newspapers, popular novels, and even technical manuals about livestock management. In return, she taught him countless practical skills about cooking nutritious meals, managing an efficient household, caring for clothing and equipment, and adding the countless small touches that transformed a simple house into a warm, welcoming home. She mended his work clothes with careful stitches, tended the vegetable garden that provided fresh food year-round, and brought music back into his life with her clear, sweet singing voice that echoed through the rooms like a blessing. The cowboys who worked for Thomas couldn't help but notice the dramatic change in their normally serious, hard-working boss. The deep lines of grief and loneliness around his eyes began to soften and fade, and he smiled and laughed more often than he had in years. The ranch prospered under their joint management as never before, with the cattle remaining healthy through the harsh winter, the financial books balanced and showing steady profits, and a sense of purpose and contentment that hadn't existed since Thomas's first wife had died. There was an atmosphere of genuine family and mutual caring that made the Mackenzie Ranch a place where men were proud to work and reluctant to leave. One warm evening in early spring, as they stood together watching a beautiful mare give birth to a perfect colt in the main corral, Thomas finally found the courage to speak the words that had been growing in his heart for months. "Sarah," he said, not looking directly at her, but keeping his eyes fixed on the miracle of new life unfolding before them. "I know you have every right in the world to be deeply suspicious of men and the institution of marriage after everything you've been through, and I know I'm probably not much of a catch for a young woman like you. I'm older than you by more than 20 years, set in my ways after decades of bachelor living, and carrying more emotional baggage from my past than any person should have to bear. But I've come to love you deeply and completely. Not as property to be owned, not as a convenience to make my life easier, but as an equal partner in the other half of my soul. If you could find it in your heart to have me, I would be more honored than I can possibly express to call you my wife." Sarah remained so quiet for so long that Thomas began to fear he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd completely misread the situation and destroyed the comfortable friendship they'd built together. But when he finally found the courage to look at her directly, he saw tears of pure joy streaming down her face and a radiant smile that seemed to light up her entire being from within. "Thomas Mackenzie," she said, her voice shaking with overwhelming emotion, "you saved my life in more ways than I can ever count or repay. You gave me back my freedom, my dignity, my self-respect, and my hope for a future worth living. Of course I'll marry you. I honestly can't think of anything I'd rather do than spend the rest of my life building something beautiful and lasting with the finest man I've ever known." They were married the following month in a simple but deeply moving ceremony attended by all the ranch hands, several neighboring families, and the traveling circuit preacher who rode through the territory twice each year. Sarah wore a dress she'd sewn herself from beautiful fabric that Thomas had specially ordered from San Francisco, white cotton decorated with tiny blue flowers. Simple in design but elegant in its very simplicity. Thomas wore his best suit, the same one he'd been married in years before, but this felt entirely different. This felt like a genuine new beginning, rather than a desperate attempt to recapture something that was gone forever. The years that followed were without question the happiest and most fulfilling of Thomas's entire life. He and Sarah worked side by side as true partners, building the Mackenzie Ranch into one of the most successful and respected operations in the entire territory. They faced numerous challenges together: devastating drought years, dangerous cattle rustlers, brutally harsh winters, and economic downturns that bankrupted lesser operations, but they faced every crisis as a united team, supporting and strengthening each other through every difficulty and setback. Sarah proved to be not just a capable ranch manager and beloved wife, but a natural leader in the broader community that was slowly developing around them. She organized fundraising efforts to build the area's first proper school, helped establish a small but active church, and became known throughout the territory for her boundless kindness to travelers and her remarkable skill at doctoring both animals and people who had nowhere else to turn for help. She never forgot what it felt like to be powerless, alone, and without hope, and she made it her personal mission to help others who found themselves in similar desperate circumstances. Over the years, they took in several other people who needed refuge and a chance to start their lives over a Chinese immigrant fleeing violent persecution in California, a family of freed slaves making their difficult way north toward better opportunities, an Apache woman whose entire tribe had been destroyed by cavalry soldiers, and others who simply needed time and space to heal from whatever traumas had brought them to their door. The Mackenzie Ranch became widely known throughout the region as a place where people could find safety, honest work, and most importantly, a genuine chance to start over with dignity intact. Sarah insisted on maintaining this open-door policy, and Thomas supported her completely, understanding that helping others was essential to her sense of purpose and meaning. They never had children of their own, but their lives were never empty or lacking in family connections. The ranch hands became like adopted sons, and many of the people they helped over the years chose to stay and become permanent parts of their extended family. The house that had once echoed with loneliness and the ghosts of departed loved ones was now constantly filled with laughter, animated conversation, and the comfortable sounds of people who genuinely cared about each other's welfare and happiness. As Thomas entered his later years, his hair turning silver and his joints growing stiff from decades of hard physical labor, he often found himself reflecting on that fateful day at Jeremiah Colt's disreputable trading post. He'd ridden there with the simple intention of buying a good horse, and had instead discovered something infinitely more valuable: a life partner, a renewed sense of purpose, and a powerful reminder of what it truly meant to be human in the deepest and most important sense. The $500 he'd spent that day had been the finest investment of his entire life, returning dividends in love, companionship, meaning, and fulfillment that no amount of money could ever purchase or replace. Sarah, now silver-haired herself but still strong, vital, and beautiful in his eyes, would sometimes catch him staring at her with that same expression of wonder and gratitude he'd worn since their earliest days together. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she'd ask with a gentle smile, settling beside him on the comfortable porch swing they'd built together during their 3rd year of marriage. "Just remembering," Thomas would reply, taking her weathered hand in his own and marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "Just remembering how incredibly lucky and blessed I am to have found you." "We both got lucky that day," Sarah would reply, her eyes twinkling with shared memories and enduring love. "You saved me from a terrible fate, but in a very real way I saved you too. We saved each other from loneliness and gave each other a reason to hope again." And in the gathering dusk of another peaceful desert evening, surrounded by the abundant life they'd built together through love, hard work, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that she was completely correct. Sometimes the most important in life, changing journeys begin with a single act of moral courage, a willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult, expensive, or potentially dangerous. He'd gone to that trading post to buy a horse, and had instead discovered that the most valuable things in life, love, family, purpose, redemption, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived couldn't be bought at any price. They could only be earned through consistent kindness, willing sacrifice, and the determination to see and honor the fundamental humanity in others, especially those who had been forgotten, abandoned, or cast aside by an often cruel and indifferent world. The ranch would outlive them both, eventually passing to the many people they'd helped, trained, and loved over the years. But more than land, cattle, buildings, or money, they would leave behind something infinitely more precious, the knowledge that one person's courage to do right could change not just their own life, but the lives of countless others, creating ripple effects of goodness and hope that would spread through generations like stones thrown into a still pond. In the end, Thomas realized that was the true meaning of the frontier spirit that had built the American West, not the conquest of land or the accumulation of material wealth, but the conquest of fear, hatred, selfishness, and moral indifference. It was the willingness to extend a helping hand to those in desperate need, to fight for justice and human dignity even when it was costly or dangerous, and to build something lasting, good, and beautiful in a world that often seemed determined to tear down everything decent and hopeful. As the brilliant stars came out over the vast desert sky, Thomas and Sarah sat together in comfortable, loving silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of gratitude, forever thankful for the day when a rancher had come to buy a horse and a girl had whispered softly, "Take me instead." It had been the beginning of everything that truly mattered in their lives, and the foundation of a love story